Did you know that before every major and usually disastrous announcement, Russia has always been playing the Swan Lake Ballet on state TV channels? And this thing sort of became the tough times are coming for Russians. And yes, the Swan Lake has been broadcasted before Putin's announcement of partial mobilization. And today I'll tell you everything you should know about it. What exactly Putin said, what are the ridiculous statements of Shoigu right after him, and why this won't be a partial mobilization. In addition to that, you will learn the response of the Russian citizens and the reaction of Western countries. And finally, I will even share some stories of my friends back in Russia who are subject to this mobilization. But more about all of this in just a couple of minutes. What's up, investors? It's the Russian Dude, and this is my special episode. So today, September 21st at 9 AM Moscow time, Putin announced a partial mobilization. Briefly, what it means is that those Russians who are currently in the reserve, or those people who have military experience, or those people who have specific skills, they'll be subject to this partial mobilization. But to be honest, a military service in Russia is mandatory, and as soon as you finish it, you are placed into the reserve. Which basically means that starting today, the majority of Russian men can be forcefully taken into the army. The mobilization started immediately after the announcement, and some people have already received their military summons. And I will talk about this more a little bit later. But then Putin made some other important announcements during his address to the nation, which obviously mainly focused on justifying the invasion in Ukraine. Such as, for example, that Ukraine is a country of terror, sponsored by Western nations, with the only goal is to butcher its own people. And basically Russia had no other choice other than intervene in this conflict. He then also said that some Ukrainian territories, such as Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporozhye, were constantly asking Russia to accept them as a part of the country. And that is why Russia will definitely acknowledge the results of these upcoming referendums. And what makes it especially ridiculous that these territories will be immediately considered as territories of Russia, which basically means any combat actions on these territories will be considered as the attacks against Russia. And because of this, Putin said all the means of self-defense, including nuclear weapons, can be used. And even though Putin was making very unpopular decisions, which made even some of his most loyal followers turn away from him, immediately after his speech, the Ministry of Defense of Russia, Sergei Shoigu, was presenting. And to be honest, it definitely seemed like that the purpose of his appearance was to take the majority of hate instead of President of Russia. Especially because Shoigu was making some of the most ridiculous statements, such as, for example, that Ukraine has lost more than 60,000 soldiers and more than 100,000 Ukrainians will never return to the army. And according to him, Russia eliminated more than half of the total Ukrainian force. And at the same time, Russia lost less than 6,000 people, which left even some Russian propagandists in complete disbelief. Shoigu then also said that more than 90% of injured Russian soldiers have been taken care of and now are returned in Ukraine. And speaking about the mobilization, Shoigu said that there are approximately 25 million people in the reserve, and Russia will only need 1% of it, which is approximately 300,000 people. He then also said that this will be a one-time mobilization, but most likely it is not true. And soon you will understand why. And by the way, if you like this style of daily updating, feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel. And here are some facts proving that most likely this will never be a partial mobilization. Alright, so according to a political scientist, Elena Schulman, at this very moment there are no borders specifying this partial mobilization, which basically means, according to her, it can be extended forever and pretty much almost everyone can be subject subject to this mobilization. And then we even have this statement by the press secretary of Russia, Dmitry Peskov. Whenever he was asked how long this mobilization will last, he basically said, I don't know, it is not specified in the presidential order. And then we even have this table specifying that there might be 3 waves of a mobilization. For example, in the first wave, which is happening right now, the perfect candidate is basically any man under 35 years old. And if Russia suddenly realizes that they still do not have enough soldiers, even men up to 60 years old can be mobilized. And even though all this already made Russian people pretty mad, the next thing that happened made them literally furious. And what I mean by that is that all the Russian politicians received this temporary postponement from the army. So it is these very people who made the decision to go to war with Ukraine and are constantly cheering for this war, and they are the ones who will never actually fight. We even have some politicians like Dmitry Vyatkin who said, well, you know, the easiest thing to do is to retire from the government and go to fight in Ukraine. But at the same time, we cannot do it because so many people rely on us. And well, the immediate response of regular Russians was to find the way how to leave the country. And as you can see from this graph, the Google Trends for this request basically skyrocketed. In addition to that, all the plane tickets in neighboring countries where Russians can fly were literally sold out in less than an hour. And because of that, as you can see from this picture, some people just started crossing the border by land. And then there's another group of Russians who decided to go protest. As you can see from this flyer, the country-wide protests in every city center were to be held at 7 p.m. local time. Many people did show up, while the others were rightfully scared, because reportedly all these men who have been detained during these protests were immediately sent to the nearest military enlistment offices. Right here, for example, you can see a video from such protests where people are being taken by the police for literally just standing. I do have many more videos of these protests and other footage, and if you want to see it, please consider checking my Patreon. All the proceeds will be donated to Ukraine, and you can find all the useful links down below. Alright, and this is exactly how this mobilization has been performed. Some people were receiving this military summons in person, while the others found these documents in their mailboxes. People could have been literally stopped on the streets or while driving their cars. And some of my friends even mentioned that the military representatives showed up at their work and gave them this military summons in person. And right here, for example, you can see some of these men waiting next to the military enlistment office to be processed. And like mentioned previously, even some of the most loyal Putin's followers had a change of their hearts in a blink of an eye. Like, I mean, as you can see from this picture, the guy removed this Z marking from his car, which, to be honest, is a very expected thing to happen. It is so easy to be a pretentious patriot, sitting on your couch and showing all the levels of support to your government, but as soon as something directly involves you, you're like, no, I'm not one of them. Alright, and now let's briefly talk about the reaction of different countries. If you remember from the beginning of this episode, Putin mentioned that in case there are attacks against Luhansk and Donetsk, Russia will not be afraid to use nuclear weapons. And well, according to the US and the majority of European countries, such as for example the UK and Netherlands, this partial mobilization and the statement about the use of nuclear weapons is basically a sign of weakness. What they mean by that is that Russia physically cannot invade these territories. That is why they had to come up with some kind of radical bluff, which is pretty much exactly the same thing I was talking about in my 2 last episodes. President Biden also mentioned that America is working with NATO countries not to allow Russia attack NATO territory. He then also added that these nuclear threats by Putin are complete nonsense and not a single country wanted this conflict besides Russia. The US General Ben Hodges also mentioned that in case Russia indeed uses the nuclear weapons, America will have to destroy the entire Russian Black Sea fleet. Then we have the statement by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia, which is saying that they will not be issuing humanitarian visas for Russians, which, to be honest, absolutely doesn't make any sense. I mean, just think about this. One Russian man who escaped Russia is one less soldier for a Russian army. These Russians, they already do not support the government and they don't want to be fighting in Ukraine. I mean, don't you think that this behavior should be promoted instead of putting additional restrictions? But anyways, I just hope that no more countries will follow the Latvian example. And finally, we had a meeting between Russia and Belarus speaking about the matters of security. Obviously, they did not specify what they were talking about, but most likely it's about Belarus putting more restrictions on crossing the border, which is basically done so that Russians cannot escape to Belarus. And then those who did, their personal information will be most likely passed down to the Russian government. Alright, and here is a quick and very important summary. So Russia announced a partial mobilization, which most likely will not be the case. I mean, just think about this. If Russia lost only under 6,000 people, more than 90% of injured returned into the army, and more than half of Ukrainian forces are eliminated, why do you need 300,000 more soldiers? And at the same time, the reason why they were focusing so much on the word partial mobilization and that only 1% will be recruited is so that Russian men do not feel like that this can happen to them. Because I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? If the chances of you being sent to Ukraine are only 1%, why do you even need to worry about it? Why worry about something that is never going to happen? I now want to personally say thank you to Green Lover, Baby Ivan or Instagram, Grathocke, Frank Mercer and Timonovsky for becoming my most recent channel members. And if you want to see me trying my best to pronounce your name correctly, please consider becoming my channel member as well. And if you want to receive immediate updates on Russian-Ukrainian war, feel free to join my Discord. And yes, it's completely free. Thank you so much for your attention, stay safe and see you tomorrow.